Hi, everyone. Welcome. What a beautiful day. No, environment and natural resources at the University of Vermont. His expertise focuses on the interaction of people and Earth's surface, with a focus on climate. A native of Baltimore, Maryland, he earned a BA at Williams College and his doctorate at the University of Washington. His research has taken him around the globe. In Greenland, he's traced the comings and goings of the ice sheet over millions of years. He is author of 2 textbooks, and in 2024 he wrote When the Ice is Gone, a look into how the U.S. military drove the development of polar and climate science as the Cold War raged. By the way, that book is available to a few of you, and his wife is back there. She's our treasurer. Let's see. He, along with his students and collaborators, have more than 185 publications in referred journals and books. He's won awards from the Geological Society of America for research and from the National Science Foundation for Scientific Education. And before I welcome him, turn off your cell phones, please. And we're going to have to figure out, unless more microphones suddenly work, when we come to Q&A, you're going to have to raise your hands. I think there's only one microphone, so I will try my best to get it to you and then back to him. This is going to be fun. Okay, please welcome Paul Bierman.
All right, well, thank you all for having me. I think it'll be easier to see when the lights are down. How well can you hear me with the mic down low? No? All right, this is going to be a little bit of a challenge. I had a bunch of surgery in my hip, and I've never held a mic up since then for half an hour. So if I give up, I'll sit down and do it that way. And I have to keep changing slides. All right, so that's Greenland. And I want to talk today about Greenland. I want to talk about the Cold War. And I want to talk about climate change. And I want to do this with a lens, and I'm unfortunately in the way of my title there, but of military and environmental history. And this has become, unfortunately, all too relevant in the last 8 weeks since the change of U.S. administrations. And the fascination, which I don't understand at all, of our current president with Greenland, but I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. I want to keep this apolitical, but give you some background on kind of what's going on. Okay, so is there any way to move that window off the top, or is that where it lives? Do it on my end, okay. I'm seeing a mute and 3. Oh, there, I see. Perfect. Good. All right. So about 80% of Greenland is today covered by ice. And that multicolored look is actually the ice sheet. And those are velocities of how quickly the ice flows on the ice sheet. And you look around the edges, and the edges are rock and tundra and a few tens of thousands of people. So there are many more people in the state of Vermont than there are living on the island of Greenland. There really are 3 large settlements, the capital Nuuk, which is on the southwest, and then Ilulissat, which is also on the west, and Kangerlussuaq further down on the west side, and everything else are villages of hundreds of people. It is so unlike any place I had ever been before I was there. More technical challenges. Let's see. There we go. All right. So this happens to be from my first trip to Greenland, just to give you a personal view on it. And there's our tents, and we are in front of the Greenland ice sheet. That's probably 7 o'clock at night. It doesn't get dark in the summer when you're up there. And this was my first view ever of a large ice sheet. And it is just, we were all kind of sitting there staring without words. And then we got on helicopters, and we did the rest of our field work flying around in these bright red helicopters. So I only know that edge, right? Because that's the only place you can get to as a geoscientist. And we collected a lot of rocks, and we collected a lot of stream sediments. And we did that because the grants we had from the National Science Foundation, again in the news because of major cuts to federal research, allowed us to understand when the ice sheet had come and gone in the past and how it eroded the material underneath. That was the premise of our grants. And that work was all done at the University of Vermont in a lab that I run there. But we're going to go back in time now. We're going to go back to 1966 and a remote outpost in northwest Greenland called Camp Century. I was 5 years old when this happened. The camp was built in 1959 when I was not even a glimmer in my now mother's 92-year-old eyes or something. So this is all predating me, right? I have no idea of what's going on here. And in 1966, at that place in the corner of the ice sheet, these two men were primarily responsible for drilling a hole through nearly a mile of ice, getting to the bottom and drilling about 12 feet of frozen soil from underneath the ice sheet. First ever. No one had ever done anything like this. And even more incredible, they spent 6 years doing it. And the first 5 years, they spent messing around because nothing worked for them and inventing the technology they needed to do it. There was no technology for drilling ice sheets. They pulled this core out in 1966. The picture you see there, and this is when I have to try two hands, about 5.5 inches wide. That's frozen sediment. The picture's taken in a freezer with these guys dressed up from below the ice sheet itself. A lot of energy was put into analyzing that mile of ice. 3 scientists looked at this frozen sediment in the 1970s and 80s, and then it was lost. And the book that was mentioned there that I wrote really details the history of the camp, the drilling, the losing of the ice, the finding of the ice, and then what we learned about it and how to set that in the global context. Okay, so there's the book. And again, we brought a couple copies here today, but you can get it online if that's what you prefer, or you want it audio or anything like that. It's around. But it came from writing this paper that I put up there that I am sure in the back you cannot read. But it's a paper that I wrote along with a postdoctoral student in 2021. And a week after it published and kind of hit the news, I got a call from a senior editor at W.W. Norton. I have never written a public book in my life. I've written a couple textbooks. I've written 200 scientific papers. I didn't have a clue how to write a book for the public. Luckily, I had 2 wonderful editors who took the textbook writer out of me and showed me how to write things for the general public. And what's interesting is the comments I've gotten on the book go from, oh my God, it's way too technical, I couldn't understand all that, to glaciologists who write me and say, why didn't you use the 3D tensor solution to this and present the equation for blah, 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 blah. So I guess I got it right that I made both 2 extremes weren't happy about it. But in the end, it was probably one of the most exciting experiences of my life, is figuring how to translate the science we do into something that people who are not scientists can understand and why. And I really am a closet historian, and you'll see that soon. I love studying history, and I think it's really important. And we've published a series of papers since then taking apart this core and trying to understand what it meant. And I'm not going to spend much time on the science today. I'm really going to focus on the history and the implications of that science. But for those of you who are interested or who are watching this recording, those are the papers, and feel free to email me if you want copies of them. They're actually all, except for one, now published in places where you can get them for free. We try to do that so that they're not paywalled. Okay, let's go back in time. This is my start of my time machine. Those 2 men are both German, and they are on the Greenland ice sheet in the fall of 1930. One of them is a guy named Alfred Wegener. Anybody know what Wegener did that makes him famous? Just shout it out if you do. Yes, continental drift. Wegener's the one who really put together the puzzle pieces of Earth's continents, put them back together and said, they must have drifted apart. It turns out that was kind of a hobby for him. His profession was a meteorologist. And so he put a camp on the center of the ice sheet, that's South Greenland, on the east and the west sides of the ice sheet. Expedition of 30 men over the winter of 30-31. And he actually had a filmmaker with him. So let's see if this works. This is digitized film from that expedition. And you'll see the men at the edge of the ice sheet. That's a really tough place to work because it's steep, it's rocky. You'll see them bringing loads up the edge of the ice. It's full of crevasses. And they had to carry a lot of this on their back, but they also had some draft animals, you'll start to see, to do this. And they were the first expedition to ever have motorized vehicles on the ice. They had this weird device that was a combination of a snowmobile, there it is, on skis with an airplane engine on the back and a propeller that pushed it along. But they had to get them up the steep margin of the ice sheet. So they're their draft animals, they're the guys. They're these aero sleds, they're called, made in Finland, actually. And then it got even steeper so that they brought out the winch. And they're pulling this thing up what must be a 45-degree slope on the ice. And then they put it together and they fire it up and off they go across the ice sheet. That's a revolution because every other expedition had either sled dogs or skis or they walked. Now you could move at a really fast pace. 1930. All right, the story doesn't end well. Wegner's the tall guy, and this is his Inuit guide. You'll notice they are all dressed in Inuit gear for traveling on the ice. Those are sled dogs. They left the first day of November from the camp in the center of the ice, determined to get back to the west side. It's dark, it's cold, it's stormy, and they didn't make it. So Wegner died on the ice sheet. His grave was found in the spring. They never found the grave of his guide, who must have carried on alone. But the men they left at the top did something really impressive. They lived underground, well, underground's the wrong word, under snow, for the entire winter. They built a snow cave. They built an igloo at the top. They had a weather station. There were 3 of them there. And this is what it looks like from the inside. They had this snow cave that got up to about 20 degrees Fahrenheit in their living quarters from a little alcohol stove because they were so well insulated. And if Wegner had stayed the winter, he would have been alive. But he didn't think they had enough food, and he wanted to get back to his men on the west side. What they did was amazing, and this is the construction of that unit. They dug a set of stairs down through the snow, and they measured the density of the snow as they went down, and they correlated it to summer and winter and summer and winter, and they went back over 20 years doing that. First time anybody realized that the ice sheet held in its layers a record of the climate of the past. So we owe, it's almost a 100-year anniversary for those guys. We owe so much of our understanding of climate to these folks who spent the winter up there and figured it out. So the next interest comes from the US at the beginning of World War II. And it comes from the Germans attacking Poland and many of the European countries. And then Roosevelt finally saying it's time for Lend-Lease and for us to support the Allies, even though we were very isolationist at that point. But the Germans had control of the North Atlantic from the U-boats. So they couldn't take the airplanes that we were building here and put them on a U-boat and ship them across the Atlantic and expect them to get there. So they had to fly them. Now, airplanes at that time, the big bombers, could have done that lower route you see that goes between Great Britain and Newfoundland, and Gander, Newfoundland. But the fighter planes could not. They only had about a 1,000-mile range. So what they ended up doing was a hop, skip, and a jump, where they started in Presque Isle, Maine, they went to Goose Bay in Labrador, they went to Greenland, and then they went to Iceland in Reykjavik. For anybody who's flown to Iceland, that Reykjavik airport is a US air base from World War II. And then they flew on to Prestwick in northern Scotland. Hop, 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 hop. The problem was they had no radar and they had very poor weather forecasting. So they had this habit of landing on the ice sheet, which was better than landing in the ocean, right? But it meant that they had to be rescued, and it pointed out just how poorly the US was equipped to operate in Arctic theaters and to deal with the cold. And the machines they had broke down, the clothing was inadequate, and soldiers died. A lot of them died. They also found what has been termed now the beginning of the weather war, that Nazi Germany had put weather stations on East Greenland. We had weather stations on West Greenland with the Danes, and the Coast Guard found the Nazi weather stations and captured, I think, 30 or 31 Nazi soldiers. They weren't really soldiers, they were meteorologists. I don't think there was much gunfight involved, and they brought them onto a Coast Guard cutter, and they got their Nazi flag and had control of the island. So the United States has had interest in Greenland since World War II and has had free access from the Danes to the country since then, too. So the whole dust-up over we need to seize Greenland always struck me as really weird as a historian, of like, we've had access for 80 years. What's the deal? And the Danes will say, you can put more soldiers here. It's totally fine. So in any case, the soldiers there had to do things like ski to get their mail that was dropped out of airplanes. And they made quite a nice existence if you read their diaries, but still they didn't have what they needed to operate well. So the Army established something called the Snow, Ice, and Permafrost Research Establishment. I guess that's redundant of establishing, but outside of Chicago, South Shore of Chicago. And they appointed this man to run it. His name is Henri Bader, and I spend a long time in the book talking about Bader. He's a really fascinating character, and if my editors didn't tell me to cut more out, there'd be another half chapter about his life. Swiss-German, left Switzerland a year before the Nazis invaded Poland, went to Argentina, married a Swiss woman in Argentina, who came from about 10 kilometers where he grew up. I don't know why and how. Spent a year in Argentina, then ended up in the Caribbean in charge of the mine that produced the most pure phosphorus in the world that was used for munitions, which makes me think he was connected to the US military even at that point. 10 or 12 days after Victory in Europe Day, he flies to the US. We've got the plane manifest from that, and then he becomes a professor at Rutgers. And within a couple of years, he's hired to run this establishment and to do research on places cold and how the Army can mobilize in places cold. And he basically designs, with some fantastic engineers working with him, a research program to understand snow and ice. That's the gestation of this Corps that we worked in. This is Bader's, I'll just play this as we go. This is Bader's passport application. And some of the things that he pioneered was how you deliver goods on the ice sheet via airplanes, how you design things like snowcats to go over the ice sheet, how you drill ice cores. This is all stuff that this man did. Just an amazing intellect. And he lived into his 90s. He died in Miami. It's a long story of that. Yeah, very mathematic. So he drilled the first U.S. ice core. He didn't drill it. He got a driller from Minnesota who knew how to drill, and they went up to Alaska, a place called the Taku Glacier that I'll revisit right at the end of this talk. But it was for a program that is called the Juneau Icefield Research Program, and some of you might be familiar with that. It is still running today. Started in 1949. It was just scientists at the beginning. Now it's actually a training program for young scientists. So I had a graduate student going there. Our daughter went there. It's 30 or so students on the ice for 6 weeks going across the ice field. And this is from the second season, 1950. They tried to drill an ice core, and they actually filmed it. There's 16 millimeter film. This is a clip of the first U.S. ice core, and you'll see this tiny little piece of ice, if it's not too dark here. Yep, there it goes. It's about 1.5 inches wide. The fun part of that story is the man who will carry this into the trench. That guy, he's the U.S. scientist who dated the moon rocks that Apollo brought back. He started working on ice cores, and then he moved to dating really old rocks. And it's a fun story for me because my PhD advisor worked with him as a PhD advisor. And I called him when I figured out that this pictures, and he's like, there's no way this guy ever worked with ice. He would only work with rocks. And then I sent him the movie. And he's like, yeah, that's right. He never told me, and he's dead now, but never told me he worked on ice. So that was kind of a fun thing. All right, let's see if the sound will work on this one. Hopefully we're put in. Nope, doesn't sound like we're getting sound. Screen is shared. I don't know how to do it with sound. Oh, I see. There's a mute on there. No, that's not unmuting. I will just narrate. So what we're seeing there is the drilling of the second U.S. ice core. That's 1956 in Greenland. And they brought an Army drill crew up. And they drilled in 56 and 57. In 57, they got 1,300 feet down. They didn't get much ice back. It was shatter, and they didn't know how to pull it out and all that. But it laid the groundwork for drilling in the ice. They're in a trench right there, about 200 miles in from the edge of the Greenland ice sheet, drilling. So Bader is responsible for the fact that we drill ice sheets these days. All right, let's see if I can move forward here. I wish I could play this one for you and you could hear it. This is actually a clip from the National Archives. Bader did a Voice of America show describing ice coring on there. And we can always go back to this after the talk. I don't want to take a long time to figure out the tech for this. But I got that from the National Archives. And so a man who I had so admired when I was doing this research but had never heard his voice, maybe a year and a half ago, an email showed up with, here's what you asked to be digitized 3 years ago. And they had digitized it. COVID was difficult for the archives. And I could hear this man's voice for the first time. It was just amazing. It's like a trip back in history. Okay, so in 1953, the Americans decide they need ice cap housing, is the way I put it. And to do that, they learned that, really from Wegener's expedition, that you stood a much better chance of surviving if you were in the ice cap rather than on the ice cap. 100-mile-an-hour winds, 40 below temperatures, you don't do well up on the top of the ice cap. But the minute you get underneath, it's a whole lot better. So this was our first plan. These are what were referred to by the Army as sewer tubes. They're not sewer tubes. They're 18-foot diameter metal conduits bolted together. They were about 100 feet long. There were 3 tunnels with interconnectors. And they put them 2 places in the ice sheet, and they called them weather stations. You'll notice there are big towers coming out of that. One's the exhaust for their generators. The others are escape hatches, because these are going to rapidly be buried in snow. Within 2 years, they were completely under the ice, and they were putting extensions on them to get out. So that's what the inside of these weather stations look like. Those guys are handling some big box. 16 men would spend 3-month rotations inside these things. I got some declassified documents that describe just how miserable they were. The bread wouldn't rise, the cakes wouldn't rise, they ran out of ping pong balls, the movies were bad, all these various complaints came back. The worst one was everything we drink tastes like diesel, because they were using diesel generators and they were melting the snow from the surface to drink. And so the response of the Army and the Air Force was to ship them a lot of orange juice for drinking. But something else did happen that I'll get to, which is Camp Century was powered by a nuclear reactor, in part because of the issues, the cost of diesel, and the complaints of the men from having to smell constant diesel fumes. So why are we doing this? We're doing this because of the beginning of the Cold War and the Red Scare. We were worried about missiles and bombers coming over the top. These were not weather stations, even though the public was told they were weather stations. Their location kept secret. These were radar installations. There was scare tactics. This one says, if Russia should win, that's an American woman under Russian boots. You get the idea. Things have changed, at least recently. And these were revealed to the public in newspapers in 1955, and in this wonderful magazine that no longer exists, probably for good reason, Real, the exciting magazine for men. And the headline, there's your man there. We built a military miracle in the Arctic, our secret base under the polar ice. I was so excited to find this, and then I couldn't get it from Interlibrary Loan. I found the title. Obscure archive at Ohio State. The librarian sent me a picture of the cover, and she didn't have it, she just had the picture. Anyway, eBay was my friend, and for $5 I bought one of these off of eBay. And when you go in there, you find out that the article right in front of this is Marilyn Monroe. Mostly clothed, you know, it's a tame men's magazine. But it showed you amazing detail of the inside of these stations. This is the sketch that led this article. And there are their tunnels, and there are the planes that delivered their fresh fruit and all their sorts of things. The U.S., this was very intentional. They were making sure that the Soviet Union knew we had these bases and what they could do, except they didn't mention the radar. But when you look online today at things that are posted by servicemen that were up there, that's a picture of the radome where the radar antenna was inside there. So it's a fascinating, fascinating story. And I posted this to some Facebook groups of veterans, and one of them wrote back and said, did you have permission to declassify all this? And the next one wrote back before I could write back and said, come on, it's 50 years ago, nobody cares. But it's a really interesting history of what's going on the ice. Okay, so this all led up to something called Camp Century. This is out of Popular Science, 1960. Again, it's propaganda. The government is making sure that the reporters have access to tell the rest of the world what we are technically capable of up there. So beautiful sketch of what it looked like on here. Great article. Again, if anybody wishes to email me, I can send you links to this stuff. We've got it all in a repository if you want to read it. This is the diagram of what it looked like. The long axis there, that the vertical tunnel is 1,000 feet long. They called it Main Street. The side tunnels are about 300 feet long. And they're full of, if you can't read these from where you are, quarters and kitchens and food storage and dispensaries, and an R&D trench. What I've circled in red there is where the science was done under here. I didn't put the top part of this diagram in, and I'm not going to talk very much about this, but there was something called Project Iceworm that has a lot of Cold War lore around it. But the idea was that the Army was going to put 600 nuclear missiles inside the ice sheet in a railroad network about the size of the state of Alabama. And they were going to be powered by nuclear reactors, maybe nuclear engines, and they were going to zip these missiles back and forth in a shell game that the Soviets would have no idea where our missiles were underneath the ice, nor the ability to destroy them because there would be so many moving around. There was a 1,300-foot railroad track built into Camp Century to test that, and that's as far as that ever got. It was a pipe dream. Okay, so this is the French view on Camp Century, which I love, out of a young adult magazine from France at the time. that shows the buildings in the trenches, the nuclear reactors up there, the giant snow blowers, the roofing they use, the helicopters, the Air Force, all that. I bought 2 copies of this again on eBay, one of which I'm still waiting to frame because I really want it hanging up in our living room or something. But it's an amazing, it's a 11 by 17 spread folded out. Beautiful piece of artwork. All right, so this is 1959, and it's just at the beginning of the building of the camp, and this is the Knoxville News Sentinel, a Southern paper, and a cartoonist who's actually quite famous who drew cartoons for the next 40 years after this. But this is his view of what the Army is going to put inside the Greenland ice sheet. It couldn't be more wrong, right? So the native Inuit do not wear snowshoes and go 138 miles across the ice sheet. There are no mountains there. There are definitely no women in bikinis up there. But there was atomic heat. That's the only thing that's right. So again, this is hitting the popular media at the time. The reality looks more like this. This is a large bulldozer, essentially, used to pull sleds that carried, in this case, the nuclear reactor. But it was a 2.5 to 3 day trip from the ice margin to the camp as a soldier in these sleds that moved about the speed you could walk, maybe a little bit faster, and would carry heavy loads. These all use diesel, so a very fuel-intensive thing. That's the nuclear power plant, says so on the side, built in Schenectady, New York. They had to drag a crane in to do the building of this thing. And they fired it up in the fall of 1960. It turned out it leaked a whole lot of radiation when they fired it up, so they immediately shut it down. Then they spent a couple months reworking it and fired it up for good in February of 61. And it ran solid for 2 years, set records for dependability. And then they pulled it out of the camp in 1964. It was supposed to go to Antarctica. It never did, and they ended up dismembering it in Idaho. You might recognize the uniform of one of those guys standing over the operator's shoulder. It's a Boy Scout uniform. Another great publicity stunt I do talk about in the book, and this lecture's too short to show you some of the video from it, but they sent an American Boy Scout and a Danish Boy Scout, 18 years old, to overwinter in the camp on the first winter. And big deal, New York Times, all over the US newspapers, huge selection process. And it had this incredibly positive spin until somebody translated the Danish Boy Scouts' diary about 5 years ago. They were not happy 18-year-olds up there. Sort of trapped under the ice, they said, with a bunch of GIs who could only talk about drinking and women. And they really weren't given any tasks except to write nice things to publish in their home papers. But again, it has struck me that an amazing technical feat with a huge propaganda machine behind it at the time. This fellow, a guy named Franklin, was assigned to decommission this nuclear reactor. In 1963, nobody had ever decommissioned a nuclear reactor. And he was decommissioning it on the ice and had to write his own manual for how to do it. He had a master's in nuclear engineering, and that was it. And so he oversaw the removal of this reactor and the transfer of the core, the highly radioactive core, into these lead barrels that were then dragged across the snow and back out and taken to Idaho on there. So a whole lot of firsts happened at this camp, not just drilling, but the idea of decommissioning a nuclear reactor. He did it in about 6 weeks. It now takes us more than a decade to do that stateside here. He did get a rather massive dose of radiation, lived into his 80s, was a general, taught at West Point, but had numerous cancers removed over his life that he attributed to that radiation. Who knows if that's actually what happened. But the story is that once he got back to the States, they demanded he go to Walter Reed in Bethesda Naval Hospital. And his body was counted for radiation. So they stripped him, they scrubbed him, and they put him in a giant radiation counter that was shielded with 6-inch thick metal from pre-World War II battleships, and he was radioactive from this. So interesting little tidbits of history. All right, so this lets you imagine what it would be like to be in the camp. And I know this is just after the camp was built because the walls look pristine. They're cut into the snow there, and they're not frosted. The power cables and the pipes are not frosted. But this is what the Army released in a newsreel. This is really well-digitized footage from the National Archives from the original newsreel there. But it's just like your average day. And there you are in the latrine with the showers, and they claim that the soldiers had unlimited hot water and unlimited hot showers while living in the Arctic. You know, that's kind of fun. We have exactly that sink in one of our bathrooms and those same handles here. And this guy gets an electric razor to shave. You know, it's like being at home, except you're inside an ice sheet. And they did 90-day rotations, too. They had a full hospital in there, too. 200 men. So this is that Popular Science I talked about in the diagram, but this is the cover of Popular Science. It's this beautiful watercolor. This is hanging in our house at this point. And this is the way they excavated the trenches. These are snowplows taken from the Alps. Remember, Bader was Swiss, so he's the one who brought these snowplows here. And the snowplows would go back and forth blowing the snow out until the trenches were 20 to 40 feet deep. Okay. And I've got a film from the Army at the time. That's how they did it. So they sent a lot of film crews up there and did some amazing, amazing film work. Then they built inside them these prefab houses. They were highly insulated. They were kept at 72 degrees, so everybody was warm. There are some images that we find hard to imagine today of GIs sitting in these hermetically sealed houses smoking away in sealed trenches under the ice sheet with no ventilation. It was described as a really stinky place between the smoking and the sewage. So they disposed of their sewage in a big well that they had steam bored into the ice, and then as you put all the warm sewage in, it just melted its way down. So one of the legacies we left up there was millions of gallons of human waste and sewage. They had a dining hall or a galley there. They had unlimited steak and turkey and chicken because they had unlimited freezer space in the ice, right? People went back 2 years after the base closed. In 1969, the last people ever in there, the ice had crushed it by then, and in this 2 weeks they were there, they talked about all the great steaks they ate that were still frozen. And sometime when the Greenland ice sheet melts out, there's going to be a lot of frozen steak that's going to come to the surface. But this is why I'm here. This is the drill rig and the drill trench, and they are drilling the world's first ice core there. So I'm going to come back to this picture. The ice core and the sediment core stayed in the U.S. until 1994, and then most of the core went to Denver, where the rest of the U.S. ice went, but the bottom disappeared. And the U.S. Ice Core community, I was a year out of my doctorate. I'd just come to UVM then. The U.S. Ice Core community said, we have no clue where the bottom is. It probably got lost and it's melted. And that's what I knew until 2018 when a Danish colleague said, guess what we found in Copenhagen? And they had found boxes with that core now cut up into little bits, 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters long, and put into cookie jars. So those they're actually American cookie jars. This was done in Buffalo, so they could be shipped, and then they were shipped to Copenhagen. There's a cloud surrounding exactly how that happened, but in 1994, they were shipped to Copenhagen, and they have been kept frozen ever since. The Danes are amazingly good at storing ice cores. That's me in April. Christine was there with me. I think the freezer was minus 27 Celsius that day, and we had clothing for Vermont in March with us, which was a mistake. Those are not warm enough gloves nor warm enough hat. And my friend Jorg doesn't even have a hat, but it was worth shivering to see these things. And we then got permission to bring the samples back. These are 3 graduate students who worked with me, the last one of which just defended her thesis this morning. And they are gathered around that same box on their trip to Copenhagen where they got to see it. That's a bit out of sequence, but within a couple months of coming back from Copenhagen, the Danes sent us 2 test samples to work on. This is what they look like. You could hold them in your hand. They look like frozen Vermont soil after the winter. Sand, gravel, a little bit of clay in there. But they stunk when we opened this up because they drilled using diesel fuel as their drilling fluid. So even 60 years later, we got a face full of diesel fuel and put them in a fume hood. But this is the fun part. We at the University of Vermont were leading this effort and had about 15 collaborators from around the world. So our job was to melt those and to save every last ounce of material, because there was so little to go around. So when we sieved it to get the different grain sizes apart and we washed it, we saved all the wash water and we filtered it. And it was a hot July day and I was staring down at that bin, and I'll play this video now, and if you can see it, which is tough with the screen, there are little black flecks that are pouring out of that and onto that filter in our lab. And then I handed the filter to the postdoc and an undergraduate working with me. There's the filter, and this is from that first day. And I looked at them and I said, I think these are little bits of plants. I think they're little fossils. And they looked at me and said a couple words. I'm not going to repeat about how crazy I was. And maybe it was heat stroke and I'd been up too long because Christine and I had been teaching high school students all week. Anyway, these are, the arrows point to those little fossils. And I did that too fast. I handed that piece of filter paper to Drew and I said, put this under the microscope and look. And there was about 20 seconds of silence as he put it under the microscope, and then he screamed again some more words. This is what he saw. twigs and pieces of moss and pieces of leaf. That is the only eureka moment of my entire scientific career, was staring down that microscope with him and going, there is no way this stuff is in frozen soil from underneath the Greenland ice sheet. What did we do wrong was the first thing. And then it was like, oh my gosh, this stuff is here. It's in every sample. And we spent that afternoon pretty giddy about all this. And then we found this guy, which is a little midge, a bug. So we knew that not only did we have the plants from that ecosystem, but we had the bugs that were living in standing water in there. And I'm spinning the clock forward a little bit, but with some friends in Utah, colleagues in Utah, they dated this to about 400,000 years ago. That happens to be the last time Earth was really warm for a really long time period. And we know that from other studies around the world. So we had now found an ecosystem under the ice from 400,000 years ago. And this is work of Hallie Mastro, who's the student who defended this morning, and she's fantastic at creating these things where she shows you the fossil, and then she shows you the plant that generated it. That's a little piece of wood from Arctic willow. That's not like willow trees we imagine here in the States. That's like willow trees that bite your ankles, basically. Little scrubby stuff in the tundra that makes it hard to walk. And that's an Arctic poppy seed. And she has a picture of an Arctic poppy. So it lets you now sort of use your imagination and go, that little piece of wood under an electron microscope tells me there's this scrubby birch growing on the ground. And that poppy seed tells me that in the middle of July, for a very short window when it gets warm enough, up pops the poppy with its yellow flower, which has, how he tells me, this cool ability to track the sun to get more sunlight, so the flower moves with the sun. And she imagines the landscape looks something like this. That's from northwestern Greenland, sorry, when I was working up there, but rocky, some parts of tundra vegetation, some sandy mineral soil, some boggy areas that are wet, very, very varied landscape on there. And so now there's Greenland today, and Camp Century is that little white dot in the upper corner. And then if we lose 50% of the ice, that's about the shape of the ice sheet. If we lose 90%, there's about the shape of the ice sheet. And the last one is the GISP-2 or summit ice core. To get that exposed, we need to lose about 95% of the ice on here. And it turns out we've done work on that core too. And at some point in the last million years, the ice was gone there too. We find the same fossils underneath the ice. So this is a diagram that's not mine. And since I dropped my pointer, I'm just going to point with my fingers on here for you. Let me explain this. These are the present over there. That's 125,000 years ago. That's 400,000 years when we know that the ice left Greenland. And this is 3 million years ago when we know it was really warm. The diagram represents sea level rises. And those are in meters, not in feet. So multiply by 3. We know that 125,000 years ago, sea level was probably about 20 feet higher than today. And if you go to the Caribbean and you look around, you'll see some flat surfaces near the beach that are about 20 feet higher than today. 400,000 years ago, it was probably even higher than that. And if we go back 3 million years ago, it was even way higher, sort of 6 to maybe 30 meters higher than today. Look at those thermometers up there. So the thermometer for present says 1 degree C. This is 2016. Now we're at about 1.5 degrees C, so 4 degrees Fahrenheit, potentially warmer, 3 degrees, no, a little under 3, sorry, 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. 125,000 years ago is thought to be about that same temperature. 400,000 is thought to be a little warmer than that. We are today, we have warmed the world enough to look like 400,000 years ago. But our sea level is not yet 20 feet higher because Greenland and Antarctica are really big ice cubes to melt. So you open your freezer, you put out an ice cube tray in the summer, it's going to take a finite amount of time to melt that. Now melt something the size of Greenland, it's going to take hundreds to thousands of years to do it. But we're headed there, and that's the take home from this. Is 400,000 years ago when it was about as warm as it is today, and it stayed warm for about 30,000 years, sea level went way up. Let's just quickly look at what happens to temperature over the sort of last 2 decades. I can run that one again. Let's see if it'll do it again. This is a New York Times illustration. And you're seeing the temperature rises every month of the year, and it's rising about 1 degree C when this ended in 2022, but we've gotten a whole lot warmer in the last few years. And if we look at the past changes between glacial and interglacial times, this back and forth, and this takes us back about 800,000 years, it's about 6 degrees Celsius. So that's the change over interglacial times and glacial times. if we keep on our current path of adding carbon dioxide, we're going to make it even that much warmer. So the difference between glacial times and interglacial times where we are now, and the difference between interglacial times in the future is about the same. That's a huge order of magnitude, thinking that glacial times put ice over us in Vermont 2 miles thick. So it's going to get a whole lot warmer. And the ice is going to melt. And so to finish this up, I told you I was talking about the Taku Glacier, where the JERP was. This is an ad from Life magazine in 1962. This is the company that becomes Exxon. And they claim in this ad that each day Humble Oil supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier, like they're proud of it. And if you read the fine print, it basically says that we're proud of this, how much energy we generate. That's no longer something to be quite so proud of. Because when you melt ice sheets, you lift all boats from this satirical cartoon. But you'll notice not only are the boats floating, but the buildings are underwater. So I just ask you to imagine your favorite beach on the ocean, wherever that favorite beach is. If you melt Greenland's ice, you're going to add about 25 feet of water to that. Now imagine your beach with 25 feet of water on top of it. And there you are. And it's why keeping Greenland's ice frozen is really important. So this is a guy named Wally Broker, and he has this famous quote that at least all of us climate science talk about. Climate is an angry beast, and we're poking at it with sticks. But I want to change that to Greenland is an angry beast, and we're poking at it with sticks. Because you can say Greenland's far away and it doesn't matter. But if we lose that ice, it's going to matter a lot to every coastal city and installation we have. And so that got me writing this winter. And this is a piece that came out in January, not long after the inauguration, entitled, "We Need Greenland, but Not the Way Trump Thinks." It's in a e-magazine called Undark. And the argument I'm making here is not to be snarky with Trump, but to basically say the real need for Greenland is to keep that ice frozen. Strategically, economically, there's all kinds of reasons. It will cost the world trillions of dollars if that ice melts on there. And I've opened my mouth in other ways too in the last couple weeks as a geologist. It's a really tough place to mine because of the lack of infrastructure and the geologic hazards that are present in Greenland. And this one just came out a couple days ago, and my goal here is to try to bridge this red-blue divide over climate change because it's not political. As much as it's been made political, it's not political. It's about all of us. And by looking toward the US military, you can see that at least until the last week, they have spent 50 years being strategic about climate change because they are mission-driven to protect our country and to reduce threats around the world. And so this is, like I say, it's a short piece. It's about 1,000 words, and you can find it online. But it just argues that the military has paid attention to climate for as long as I've been alive, and for good reason. So I'm going to leave you with that. These are some resources if you're interested. The book is in the back. There's some web pages here, my web page, the project web page, and I will answer any questions folks have. So do we have 2 working mics? Awesome.
All right.
I may have a solution as to where those bottommost cores went.
Tell me.
There is a friend of mine, his brother worked at the Cold Region, New Hampshire Scientific Building, whatever the name is. And I remember him talking probably about 5 or 6 years ago about cores from Greenland, and they don't know how they ever got them, but you're nodding your head like you know of them.
Well, the cores were at Krell, as far as I know, until 1974 when they moved to Buffalo. So Krell held this core in completely, and then Chet Langway, one of the people sitting by that core that I showed you the picture of, Chet moved to Buffalo, and he took the cores with him to Buffalo. The part that we don't understand is when Chet retired in the early 1990s, he was supposed to send all of those cores to the U.S. repository in Denver. So his repository got closed after 20 years, and the U.S. Geological Survey took over and built a repository in Denver. He sent most but not all of the cores at that point. And the rest ended up in Denmark, and it depends on who you ask, why and how, and history is a little murky on that. But the thing that really matters is the entire core is now accounted for between what's in Denmark and what's in the US. But I don't know what else Krell has, which might be really interesting. So I'd love to be able to talk to your friend if he is still with us. David? Fisk, okay. Do you have a contact? We can talk afterwards. That'd be great. Absolutely.
He bought one of your books, by the way.
Thank you. Much better than buying it off Amazon.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes, even if they do come to Essex. Oh. Yeah. Any other questions? No? No?
Oh,
No?
but it's one behind you.
Oh. Where? Okay. Oh, we've got plenty.
So you alluded to it in the introduction, but what is sort of the official thought process that the Trump U.S. acquiring Greenland people are espousing, and what is sort of the interpretation that people who looked at their official story have as the real deal? Because, I mean, like, it's obvious in politics people have different levels of arguments for things, and with the Trump administration, it's especially true.
I knew that was coming.
Yeah, I actually have no idea. I got a call from a Der Spiegel reporter, 10 days ago, asking me exactly that question because I published that op-ed and I published the piece on minerals. And I think he leads the story with a slightly altered quote for me that says something like, I have no idea what Trump is doing. It was, I think it's been translated to German and then back translated into the US or into English. There was a Senate hearing that got me started on this probably a month ago that Ted Cruz led. It was mostly focused at that point on strategic minerals and energy. And it was a lot of blustering, as you might expect. You can find that hearing online. It takes about 10 minutes, and then you'll probably turn it off. I suffered, as Christine can attest to, I suffered through 2 hours of listening to this. All prepared statements, responding to prepared questions. The minerals in Greenland are there, for sure, the critical minerals. The infrastructure to remove them is not there. And there's been 20 years of exploration, and there are 2 working mines. And that should tell you from the private sector point of view that all the congressional blustering you want, there's not a lot of interest and money to do this work. It's extremely risky. It's really cold in the winter. There is no road network. There is a port network, but it's not extensive to ship out a whole lot of ore. There is an interest in the hydropower in Greenland that I think is much more realistic. So you have all this melting ice, you've got a lot of water, you've got a lot of lakes that keep that water over the winter even when it's frozen. And there was a really interesting point brought up in that hearing that suggested, what if we move our AI data centers to Greenland and we use massive hydropower to power them? And I thought, that's actually kind of an interesting idea, right? You've got all this power, you can use the cables and the fiber to get the data back and forth, and we're spending a huge amount of power now on AI data centers that could become green. There was a fuss over the strategic value of Greenland, and I didn't get it all. There was something about the submarine gap between Iceland and Greenland and the Russian submarines and the icebreakers. It just reminded me of World War, sort of Cold War, you know, the missile gap and the this gap and the that gap. That didn't seem, we must have ways to defend that part of the world. So I'm not quite sure what it's about. Is it sort of a new Monroe Doctrine of we're going to spread the United States over whatever, you know, territory, Canada, Greenland, that happens to be near to us? Greenland is related to North America geologically, so I really don't have a good answer. I think it's mostly blustering. But the hydropower is interesting. The critical minerals, I had a friend email me and say, do you realize that we are now shipping critical minerals from a mine in the US to China for processing? We don't have the processing stream here, so that one really woke me up of like, wait, what are we gonna do in Greenland if we don't have the processing stream for this? So I don't know, in my best days, I think it's just a distraction. I don't know what's distraction from, but logically, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The biggest reason it probably doesn't make sense is the Danes have been friendly to us since 1940 when we signed a treaty allowing our military to be in Greenland. We had 10 bases in Greenland during World War II. We had a base at Thule that held 10,000 men, nuclear weapons, nuclear bombers. We've abandoned all that. We have 150 military people at Thule right now and like 600 support people. So we could have all that back in an instant. And the Danish prime minister said that. It's like, bring it on, bring more people here. We're fine with that. So yeah, your guess is as good as mine what's really driving all this.
There was another question. I saw a hand raised. Oh,
There's-
Miles? No? Oh. You got it.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. So, my background's in the biological sciences, and I know that if you look at biological science research from the basic standpoint, basic research versus applied research, private sector supporting of research tends to be heavily directed at applied and finding something for which you can have commercial, value and payback. Private sectors tend not to fund basic research, but so much applied research is based on the results of basic research. So I see that as being devastating if they start to cut back federal or public funds, federal funds to support basic research, whether in the biological sciences or in the geological sciences. I presume you see the same.
I can't agree more. And I actually think the most devastating part we're seeing coming through now is it's cut off the next generation. So as colleges are no longer, universities are no longer taking graduate students or canceling graduate student acceptances, and research assistantships are disappearing and projects are disappearing. Once the pipeline is turned off and those labs are shut, rebuilding American science expertise is going to be decades long. I mean, we've been building this since the end of World War II. And I'm not going to argue that the system is perfect right now. It's not. There are flaws in our academic research system, but it has brought us so many things that we all have in our pockets and drugs that we're taking. And to me, that's the most devastating part of watching this is the chaos that's now hit the academic federal research partnership. And you're completely right. And I look at what the Army did. I mean, the U.S. Army funded the basis for climate science that we all depend on right now. They put countless millions into building Camp Century so that this ice core could be drilled basically indoors, right? And 6 years and all the support to do it. The National Science Foundation put $600,000 in 1960 to make this happen. And yet nobody knows that the military is why we know so much about climate, and that the military kicked off the climate change science in this country. And so I think that's a hugely fertile point, because the divide is such, not knowing anybody's political leanings in this room, that at this point, if you're Democratic, you believe in climate change and climate adaptation. If you're Republican, you don't. But that's just foolish. I mean, you look back, and this was large part of this work was done under Democratic administration, but it was started under Republican administrations. And the Clean Air and Clean Water Act were under Nixon, and it's all scrambled right now. But I think the interest that last piece I wrote has gotten is because it does try to bridge that divide and say the military started us on understanding climate, and it continues to be sensitive to climate. So I don't know if there's a way, as you were saying, to get the politics out of this supporting research piece and to realize that it benefits every American, no matter who they voted for, where they live, how much money they make. I mean, it benefits every one of us to have a science infrastructure that works in this country. I mean, who knows when the next COVID shows up, right? And the fact that we could produce those vaccines in a year is a miracle. And how many hundreds of thousands of lives did that save? And that we can almost all sit here today going, yeah, we've all been either vaccinated or had COVID, and if we get it, it might be a severe illness, but it's probably not going to kill us. That's due to the science that we have in this country. So anyway, that's my soapbox, not related to climate.
When I first heard about those cores, the ice cores, my memory might be wrong, but I thought that NOAA was involved in that. No? Is NOAA involved in this?
Not in ice coring, but NOAA is critical to monitoring the current climate, and NOAA has lost a large number of scientists in the cuts recently. The Weather Service started announcing all the balloons they're no longer sending up. When they do that, our weather forecasts get worse. And all I can say is just wait to hurricane and tornado season. They've cut, I think, the number of hurricane hunter planes and pilots and analysis. This is going to come back to bite us really quickly. And the irony of it is as the climate system is getting less and less stable, all I can say is I think the belief in Washington is if we don't see climate and we don't hear climate and we don't talk about climate, it's going to go away. But it's going to be exactly the opposite, is that if we stop monitoring, it's going to surprise us in ways that we don't want to be surprised. And I mean, as Vermonters, all we have to do is look at the last couple summers and, 100-year floods 2 years in a row, following Irene, which wasn't that many years ago. Our climate's changing. We're getting 20% more precipitation in Vermont than we got 100 years ago. That's going to trigger landslides. It's going to trigger floods. You're going to have wet basements. I mean, all those things are going to change. So the best thing we can do is know what's coming and protect ourselves against it. So I think it just seems like foolishness to me.
Someone raised a hand.
Front row?
Oh, here we go. Wait.
Does Greenland is an independent country, right? Now, what's its relationship to Denmark, and can it defend itself from being taken over by?
So Greenland has been under Danish rule for several hundred years. You can go back to the Norse and go even further, right? So the Norse settled part of Denmark 1,000 years ago, but in the 1700s, the Danes began to populate parts of Greenland. And then in the last decade, Greenland has had increasing amounts of self-rule. So Denmark still puts, I think, about a third of the Greenlandic economy is actually Danish subsidies at this point. And when you go to Greenland, and I would encourage any of you who can get there to get there. It's an amazing, amazing place. You can actually now, apparently, I heard in the Senate hearing, United will fly you there directly this summer. It's worth it. It's totally worth it. But when you go to Greenland, you will notice how Danish it is. You go into a grocery store, and almost every piece of groceries you're going to buy comes from Europe, and most of it's Danish on there. They don't have a defense force. The Danish supply the defense for Greenland. The question is, without a bellicose U.S., do they really care? And so they've never been threatened since World War II on that. So, yeah, it's Danish. Many people in Greenland, I think, would like independence, but realize that they need support from another country to do that.
Does the ice sheet move? In other words, when you're drilling, different sections of it are moving faster or slower. So how do they counter that?
That's absolutely correct. And today what people do is they go to a part of the ice sheet. So if you think about it really simply, and it's hard to do with a mic, the snow settles on top of the ice sheet, and then the ice itself deforms, so it will flow outward. What people try to do is drill holes at what's called the ice divide at the center, at the high point, so that the motion of one particle of ice is downward until it gets just to the bottom, and then it heads off for the coast. So Camp Century is really interesting because the Army had no clue how deep the ice was under there. They hadn't done any seismic work. They were looking for a place to put the camp that was flat. So they went in 100 miles, Century, 100, and it wasn't flat. So they kept going to mile 138 on their trail across the ice, and the engineers were like, it's flat here. Let's build our camp. Now we know that that's a local ice divide. That's the high point in that local area. And so they accidentally, kind of on purpose, found the right place to drill, having no clue that was the right place to drill. So most of the ice motion there was vertical, downward. So they had a great place to core, not knowing it. They also didn't know what was under there. They didn't know that the ice there was frozen to the bed. I think the temperature is about minus 11 Celsius, so it's frozen hard to the material below, which means that's why we had stuff to work on. Had it been melted at the bed, there would simply be mud and a lot of erosion. There's actually a really interesting paper that Bader published before they made it through the bottom of the ice sheet. It's an early 60s paper, wondering, is it going to be frozen? Is it not going to be frozen? Are there going to be pockets of explosive gas that have been trapped under the ice? I think there were some Russian glaciologists who were worried about explosive methane, and would they all die when they drilled through the bottom? Nobody died. And the apocryphal story is they got to the bottom on July 4th. That's what's in all the newspapers. The New York Times has that. The drilling log says just what the truth is. But they made it through. They were fine. And the only reason they stopped drilling is they blew a bearing in the drill. They would have kept going. But the Ueda, and this is a good story I think to close on because we're about 3 o'clock. A fellow named Herb Ueda was the actual driller who did all of the work. And Ueda did a beautiful oral history before he died. And he talked about this, talked about getting to the bottom and the bone bearing. But I think the story that's really pertinent about Herb Ueda is he spent World War II in an internment camp in the United States. He was Japanese American, got out of the camp at the end of the war and went to college, and they got offered a job to be an engineer in the Army Corps, and said, yeah, I've got kids to support, and it's not a bad thing you're sending me away for 3 months every summer. I get a little piece because he had like 5 kids or something. It's a great story, but he went on to drill this core as a Japanese American working for the U.S. military. And I think that tells you about the importance of diversity in the military at a time when it's being shut down right now. That, again, there's stories to be told in this whole Camp Century bit that are relevant to today, even though it was 60 years ago.
Thank you so much. It's great.